I am Galen Gissler with Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEEC, located in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I will be the moderator for this evening's talk. PEEC has lots of ways you can interact and connect with nature, even while we're closed. Check our website, peeknature.org. All our online content, including outdoor challenges and talks like this one, will be there. We're able to offer programming at this time because of our wonderful members and donors, and we'd like to thank you for your continuing support. Okay, I'm gonna unmute Rick, and you can see him on your screen, I hope. Rick Wallace has a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics from UC Santa Cruz. He worked as a staff member at Los Alamos National Laboratory for 30 years, working on physics simulations. His hobbies include nature photography and astronomy education. I'll turn it over to Rick now and monitor for any questions or comments coming in on the chat. Enjoy.
All right, thank you, Galen. So once I get this thing working, nothing's happening. There we go. Life in the universe. What do we really know? Now, I've given some talks like this in the past. What will make this one slightly different is that I've updated it with some of the most recent studies. And in fact, it's really kind of amazing. In the last couple of weeks, there have been a number of papers published related to our estimation of how likely it might be for there to be life somewhere out there besides on the Earth, in the universe, and maybe even intelligent life. And we'll go through a number of those things as we proceed. First, before I get to the new studies, let me go through a little bit of background. And some of this will be familiar to some of you, but the points I will make about the slides are a little different this time. The other thing is that the, well, maybe I won't say that. We'll get to it in a few minutes. First, let me point out that most people are familiar with aliens from science fiction. The movie Aliens began as men in rubber suits, then progressed to advanced puppets, and finally to computer graphics or CGI. However, some characteristics generally remain humanoid. This is perhaps more than just wanting us to be able to relate to them. And we'll talk about that toward the end of the presentation. But as we go through the potential aliens, you might take a look and see what you think might be some common attributes. Of course, the 1950s was the age of the rubber suit. The 1960s was the age of the hairy rubber suit. But they also had some prosthetics and makeup. Reptilian aliens, what would happen on Earth if a meteor had not killed off the dinosaurs 66 million years ago? Would we look something like this? The other one is the large brain with telepathic powers. Is that a natural evolution for Homo sapiens, where our brain does seem to be getting larger over billions of years? Eventually, some movie aliens became less humanoid, but still a type of rubber suit. And here we have the silicon-based creature in the Star Trek TV show that looks kind of like a colorful blanket thrown over somebody crawling around on the ground. We also had cute fuzzy animals that were dedicated to rapid reproduction. And I don't have time tonight to show you the clip from this TV show that I would normally show. So I'll have to skip that, but just take my word for it. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek episode. Of course, bioengineered animals, in this case, with a hard exoskeleton, acid blood, and a nasty disposition, is maybe not as far-fetched, well, except the acid blood, as you might think. Current gene editing technology, CRISPR and others, make such things actually quite believable for the fairly near future. Now, in 1979, Star Wars also had a little bit of morphing. George Lucas created the Wookiee as a cross between a Malamute dog, a cat, and an arboreal monkey. The autonomous AI robots are already becoming popular in research as well as science fiction. Now, of course, you can always throw a blanket over an elephant, but there are other ways. Puppets allowed the movie to move away from human costumes and yet still have the characteristics that we can relate to as humans. Advanced intelligent life may have evolved on ocean planets as extensions of animals such as whales, dolphins, and squids here on Earth. Jabba the Hutt, of course, was a bit different. He was a giant talking slug. Moving further from humanoid, but he still has some interesting characteristics. A head, forward-facing eyes, 2 arms, 3 fingers, bilateral symmetry, some things that we'll keep seeing over and over again. Of course, by 1999, computer graphics allowed the inclusion of E.T.'s homeworld in the Star Wars empire. You can see them in the lower left corner there. Humans, as many social animals on Earth, are warlike creatures, so one might expect aliens to also be a bit warlike and perhaps be fighting with each other. Now, the Dune sandworm was completely non-human, so that was a real departure from the humanoid type aliens. But augmented human cyborgs are a pretty sure bet for the future. We already are starting to see artificial vision, hearts, limbs, and so on. In fact, I myself have an artificial heart valve. Now, Avatar is something a little different. James Cameron hired a group of scientific advisors with backgrounds in physics and biology. The computer graphics allowed him to bring his world that he imagined to life. We will not mention unobtainium, however. Now, Pandora is a tropical moon orbiting a gas giant planet in the Alpha Centauri system, the closest star system to our own. And it is small. It has a lower gravity on the Earth. So plants and animals grow larger. One could conceivably imagine that as plants grew larger, that they may produce more oxygen through photosynthesis, making things, again, grow even larger. Pandora has a strong magnetic field, allowing metal-rich mountains to actually float. Now, flying mountain banshee is actually a sort of a cross between a pterosaur, which did exist on Earth at one point, and a giant bat. But the lower gravity and higher oxygen allowed larger animals to fly. And the Pandora plants were envisioned by biologists for a body with this low gravity and this atmospheric content. Again, autonomous AI robotic systems play a big role in a lot of science fiction movies. I mean, I have one here, for example, but he requires a cell phone for me to have him run around the floor, whereas these guys were completely autonomous. Of course, autonomy is currently a hot research topic. For example, self-driving cars. Tardigrades are an extremophile on Earth. We'll talk a little more about them in a moment. But the Star Trek Discovery people in 2017 took an existing known extremophile creature on Earth and scaled it up to be larger and just have exotic capabilities. Again, notice the bilateral symmetry, though. You can draw a line right down the middle of the animal, and the right half and the left half look pretty similar. So what do we really know about life in the universe? This weekend, in fact, is the 73rd anniversary of the Roswell UFO incident. William Brazel, who was a foreman working at the Foster Ranch, noticed clusters of debris 30 miles north of Roswell. The official explanation was Project Mogul, a top secret project by the US Army Air Forces involving microphones flown on high altitude balloons whose primary purpose was long distance detection of sound waves generated by Soviet atomic bomb tests, sort of like shock waves in the atmosphere. It's interesting to note that this is actually similar to the infrasound detectors currently used by the Global Test Ban Monitoring Organization, CTBTO. Aliens and UFOs. Well, National Geographic had a survey with the Harris poll in 2014 and found that 77% of Americans believe, quote, there are signs that aliens have visited the Earth. In 2013, a UFO investigation organization received over 6,000 UFO reports in the USA alone. Alien proponents often believe in vast governmental conspiracies like the Roswell cover-up, Area 51 alien spacecraft, and so on. And the former president of the World Chess Federation believes in alien visitation, believes he was abducted to visit their planet, and that they invented chess. 40,000 Americans have insured themselves against alien abduction. There are a few other people that you might recognize their names, and have also come out sometime in the past and stated their belief in aliens and alien visitation to the Earth. That includes people like Russell Crowe, Mick Jagger, Muhammad Ali, Olivia Newton-John, Sigourney Weaver, David Bowie, Ben Aykroyd, who saw both Aliens and Men in Black, and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. In fact, Tom Cruise is rumored to have built a $5 million bunker at his house in Colorado as a hedge against alien invasion. Demi Lovato believes both aliens and mermaid alien species not only exist, but the mermaid aliens are hiding right now in the Indian Ocean. In the 15th century, so this is the 1400s, the Madonna with St. Giovannino has an interesting object in the background. An alien flying saucer can clearly be seen in the background and is the focus of attention of both the man and the dog near the cliff. Now we're going to try something. We'll see if it works. Maybe Galen, you can unmute and let me know if you see something. We're actually not sure Galen can, but some others who are not hosts might be able to see this. I'm going to throw up a poll. If you wouldn't mind, in just a few seconds, take a look at this poll that should be on your screen now, and just click a button next to one of the options. There are only 3 questions. Of course, if you're in a family, you might have to do a little voting to get to an answer, but see how many of you can get us some results here in a few seconds. Just very quickly, without thinking too hard off the top of your head, click those buttons. And I'll wait a moment for votes to come in. We have 75% of you have voted. Wait just another second or so. Okay, so do you believe that there is some type of life in our galaxy? In fact, 95% of the people who voted said probably yes. Do you believe there are intelligent technological civilizations in our galaxy beyond the Earth? Maybe not visited the Earth, but that they're out there somewhere. Here we get 62% yes, 29% no opinion, and only 10% no. Do you believe extraterrestrials from another planet have actually visited the Earth? And here we're down to 48% skeptics. You can tell we're in Los Alamos. Probably yes, though, is 25%, almost 30% for maybe, don't know. So I thought that was an interesting set of results. You may have to scroll to see all of them. Okay, let's move along. Okay, now there was a Navy fighter jet that recorded a UFO in 1994. The official naval name for this is the FLIR video. And there were 2 others that the Navy just released in April of 2020 as unclassified information. They said they had finished their examination of it and they could release it to the public. And I'm going to give you a very short excerpt from an analysis of these videos.
All right, well, let's start with the FLIR video. That's the oldest video. The FLIR video is it's actually a very small video. It's like 200 pixels wide or something like that. Very, very small and blurry. And it shows like a dark dot in the distance, dark kind of shape. And the camera operator who was in this jet following this thing is cycling through different cameras trying to get a better look at it, but you never really get any good look at it. The object itself, if you pay attention to what's going on, the object itself never actually moves from the center of the screen. It does appear to move, but that's only because the camera is changing. It changes lenses between like a narrow field of view and a wider field of view, or it's changing between the infrared mode and the TV mode, the visible light mode. So whenever it has to change from one camera to another, it loses the lock on the object and has to reacquire it. So what we're seeing basically is an essentially static object. It is actually moving. It's because you can see that the camera is tracking from right to left, because you can see the numbers, the heading at the top of the screen changes. So it is moving. So it's entirely consistent with it being a plane that's very far away, probably somewhere in the range of 50 to 100 miles away. And the jet that's following it, again, perhaps doesn't realize just how far away it is and thinks that it's a little bit closer and hence moving a little bit differently, or perhaps is a bit smaller than it actually is. It could be a quite large plane 100 miles away.
Right. So if I can ask, why didn't they catch that on the radar then? Why weren't they able to identify that as an aircraft already?
It wasn't where they thought it was. It's the same thing with the Chilean case. Radar is great if you know where to look, but if you're looking in like sector A and it's in sector Q, then you're not going to see it in sector A. So if they were just looking in a range of say like 40 miles in front of them, they're not going to see it on the radar. He got a ping on his radar, I think, and you see the little range crop up, but it shows 99.99, which means it wasn't able to get an actual range distance, which could mean that it was blocking it somehow, but it could also just mean that it was just too far away to get an accurate reading. I think that's probably what happened. He thought there was something close to him. He asked the ship perhaps if there was something next to them, and they looked directly in front of him and didn't see it, but it was really over here, so that's why they didn't see it.
And that one definitely looks the least strange of the three, I would say, as looking at it from the outside. So moving on to Gimbal, which we seem to see something which looks like it's rotating. There's two blobs. You've talked about this in a few of your videos over on your channel, which I will make sure to link down below. But tell us, what do you think is going on with the Gimbal video?
What I think is going on with the Gimbal video is that it's actually the glare from the infrared, So the engines of a plane are very, very hot, and they show up in a heat-sensitive camera essentially as bright lights. Now, in this video, it's inverted, so hot is black. So it looks like a black object, and you've got the shape of the glare. Now, you're familiar with, in astronomy, you often see what looks like a cross over a star or a celestial object of some sort because of the diffraction effect. And this is actual, the aperture of the camera has an effect on what the glare looks like. And what's happening, I think, here is that you're getting essentially a flying saucer-shaped glare, which I've actually replicated with little cameras I have on my own. And it's because it's so bright, because the engine is so hot, it's obscuring the actual outline of the plane, which you might see in the infrared, which wouldn't be very hot anyway, so you wouldn't see very much of it. So all you're seeing is this glare of the engine. Now, where it gets... All right, well, let's start with the FLIR.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the video there just because we don't have very much time. If you're interested in that video, you can just do a Google search on Nick West Explains Navy Videos, and you'll be able to see the entire video. It's actually, I think, around 20 minutes long. There were 3 naval videos, and he explains all 3 of them quite easily. So take a look at that if you have an interest in that. Now, the website, boingboing.net, just 2 weeks ago, pointed out that they had solved a long-standing issue. Quote, humans have long benefited from help from alien life forms. They taught us how to make fire, possibly introduced the virus that gave us consciousness, and even invented Febreze. Recently, however, we haven't been seeing much proof of alien life. The reason: they are too sensitive to our electromagnetic radiation pollution. All of our cell phones, TV signals, radio signals, polluting the earth, and they're just basically too sensitive or allergic to it. So now we know the answer to that. Now, there actually is a real legitimate scientific organization that does investigate these things. It's called the SETI Institute, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They use a dedicated telescope array located in the mountains of California to search for narrowband radio transmissions that would indicate technically competent beings elsewhere in the galaxy. They have a new project that was just announced in June, so last month, where they're going to look at the atmospheres of exoplanets to look for the absorption features of chlorofluorocarbons. Some of you may recognize this as the atmospheric pollutant from the 60s and 70s that caused an ozone hole over Antarctica, which is now beginning to heal up, but was really bad for a while. And it turns out that every atom or chemical element has a very specific spectral signature. If you look at a spectrum of, split the light into infrared, red, green, blue, violet, ultraviolet, and so on, that these elements or materials will glow in very specific narrow bands of that spectrum. And by looking at where those bands are and correlating them appropriately, you can find out what the material is. So they plan to look at exoplanets as the exoplanet crosses in front of its star and is backlit, and see if there are some CFCs that might show up in the spectrum. The other thing, again, using spectroscopy, is that solar panels absorb light of certain wavelengths and reflect the rest. The spectral edge in their reflected light is different from that produced by vegetation. So one might, again, be able to spectroscopically determine if there is perhaps a massive array of solar panels on a planet. Now, this is interesting, and we'll get to this a little bit later, that most planets that might hold life are likely to be very small, cool red dwarf stars. And the planets around red dwarf stars that are in their habitable zone, which we'll talk about later, basically means they might have liquid water on the surface, are likely to be tidally locked, just like the moon only shows one face to the Earth all the time. These planets might have one face showing toward their star all the time. And that would be a great place to build a huge solar panel array. So the habitations may be kind of in between the light and the dark side of the planet, but getting their power from these solar panels. So there's another way that these folks hope, with the help of the James Webb Space Telescope, a new telescope to be launched into space about a year from now, to perhaps look for indications of life. Now, here's one of the other new publications, studies that just became available in, June 15th. So again, 2 weeks ago. New calculations suggest that the most likely number of contactable alien civilizations is 36. Well, that was the headline. If you look into what it is really talking about, they make a number of assumptions. First of all, they make the assumption that the Earth is not special. Now, some people would disagree with this, but their assumption is that the physics and chemistry going on here on Earth are the same physics and chemistry that are going on elsewhere all over the galaxy and the universe, in fact. And we do see, when we look with telescopes and other instruments into the skies, that it appears to be correct, that the physics and chemistry is exactly the same out there as it is here. So they assume that Earth is not special. Then they have a couple of other assumptions that they looked at in several different ways. One is that planets form intelligent life after about 5 billion years, which is kind of true for the Earth. Specifically, the other case is that life must form between 4.5 and 5.5 billion years. Earth evolved intelligent life, us, civilization, in about 4.5 billion years. So this puts, the other thing is that they would like to assume the lower limit to civilization radio lifetimes, that is the amount of time which a civilization will be emitting radio signals into space, is 100 years. And that's what we've had so far on Earth. And of course, if that number is much smaller because they extinguish themselves in a nuclear war, or much larger, then that will affect the results. But the assumption is 100 years. And you take the worst case of all of these assumptions, and what you get is 36 civilizations in our galaxy with some error bars, pretty large ones, plus 175, minus 32. And this implies, if you take the 36, that the nearest communicating extraterrestrial intelligence is at most 17,000 light years away, and most likely hosted by a low mass M dwarf or red, small red star. Now, at that distance, it would be undetectable by us in the foreseeable future. But if the civilization's lifetime is greater than 100 years, then there could be a much larger number of these civilizations, which means the nearest neighbor might be much closer. So, for example, if you have civilizations that have a radial lifetime of 1,000 years, then you might have hundreds of these civilizations instead of just a couple dozen. Now, remember that Voyager 1, the fastest spacecraft we have so far, traveled 1/2 of 1% of a light year in 43 years. So it would take a very long time to go several thousand light years. Now, I mentioned this assumption that Earth is not special. Some people would challenge that and say that the Earth has a specific history. And even if you set aside magnificent supernatural beings, we did have this situation where we had a Mars-sized protoplanet in the early formation stages of our Earth that collided with the Earth and gave rise to a reformed Earth and the Moon. The Moon helped stabilize the Earth's tilt to near 23 degrees. You'll remember that this tilt of 23.5 degrees is what causes our seasons, as you know, the tilt, the rotation axis, is tilted 23.5 degrees to the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun. And this means that the southern hemisphere is more illuminated in one part of the orbital cycle, whereas the northern hemisphere is illuminated more in another part, and we have summer and winter seasons and so on. Our tilt varies between about 22 and 24.5 degrees over a period of 41,000 years. And in fact, this 41,000 year period may be related to ice ages. So the point here, let me see, I'm trying to hit something with my pointer and not doing a very good job of it. The point here is that if the Moon helps stabilize the Earth's tilt, without the Moon, perhaps the Earth's tilt would vary wildly on a much shorter time scale, causing ice ages and unpredictable weather patterns that would be difficult for life to be able to handle. I mentioned the James Webb Telescope. This is to be launched now in March of 2021. So that's only less than a year. We'll see if it keeps to this schedule. It will attempt to identify atmospheric gases of exoplanets for to look for signatures of biological things. It has a 21-foot diameter primary mirror compared to only 8 feet for the Hubble Space Telescope. But what about visitation? If the nearest aliens are thousands of light years away, then to visit each other, we need to travel faster than the speed of light. Well, how do we do that? So far, I would say that there is no unconditional, uncontested proof that intelligent aliens have actually visited the Earth. But our current understanding of physics makes alien visitation extremely unlikely without spectacular breakthroughs in physics and energy generation. Right now, there's no known way to travel faster than light or to fold space-time. People are working on it. In particular, Miguel Alcubierre, who is a Mexican physicist, worked through Einstein's equations of general relativity and found that, in fact, you could develop a spaceship that might be able to bend space-time. And Harold Sonny White from NASA was able to reduce the energy requirements of this spaceship to a total of 700 grams. Now, remember that E equals mc squared, so mass is sort of like energy. If you could take the mass of an automobile and turn it into a certain type of energy, that would be sufficient to power the spaceship. That's not an easy thing to do. But in particular, the kind of energy you required is something called negative energy. You could think of it as anti-gravity. Note, though, that precisely this type of anti-gravity, repulsive gravity, negative energy does seem to make up a large fraction of the energy in the universe in what we call dark energy and cause the accelerating expansion of the universe. Now, it appears to be very diffuse. We do not yet know what it is or if it could ever be harnessed in large concentrated quantities, but that gives some people a tiny bit of hope. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson, director of the Hayden Planetarium, has a few quotes that I've listed here. I'm not going to go through and read all of these. You can do that or just look up Neil deGrasse Tyson thoughts on aliens and you'll get a hold of them. He says that there are more planets in the universe than the sum of all sounds and words ever uttered by every human who has ever lived. Why would the Earth be the only one with life? And then he goes on at the bottom to say, we are made from the most common elements in the universe, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. If we were made of molybdenum, bismuth, and plutonium, then we might suspect that we are special, but we're not. We're made of the most common elements. Now, the definition of life is somewhat flexible. Wikipedia involves words like maintaining homeostasis, like temperature and so on. Life is composed of cells, it has the capacity for metabolism, growth, adapting to the environment, responding to stimuli and reproduction. But NASA has a much simpler version, a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Now, the NASA definition of life encompasses, for example, viruses, which the previous definition would not. So from our observations here on Earth, we understand that life requires water, or at least a solvent, perhaps an organic solvents like on Titan, and it involves carbon, and it requires an energy source. We conclude that where there is liquid water, complex carbon-based molecules, that life may also exist. And it turns out the water is really easy. If you take all the water on the surface of the Earth and ball it up into a little sphere, you get something about this size on the right here. Notice that Europa has twice as much water, we believe. Ganymede, another moon of Jupiter, has 6 times as much water. Titan, one of the moons of Saturn, has 11 times as much water. And Mars may even have had some water in its past as well. Let's look at the carbon requirements. Carbon is the lightest, most abundant element with 4 valence electrons. What that means is the carbon atom can form 4 covalent major bonds, while nitrogen can only form 3, oxygen can only form 2. Carbon can also form double bonds, allowing very strong, complex branching molecules. Carbon is light. It is an abundant element capable of forming these flexible molecules. Life is also complex. Life needs to be flexible to survive. Carbon is uniquely qualified to be the basis of complex life chemistry. Water, of course, is the universal solvent and can dissolve many substances, so that's why we would really like to see liquid water in these conditions. So a hydrocarbon, very simple molecule of methane, for example, is just 4 hydrogens combining with a carbon atom. Ethane is a little bit more complicated with a couple of carbons in it. The most common reactive elements in our galaxy, again, are hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. Amino acids are exactly that. Life on Earth is based on DNA and RNA. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. DNA being the double helix, which is made up of carbon-based molecules called nucleotides. There are these 4 nucleotides shown here. DNA is the complex double helix that forms most life on Earth. but very simple organisms may only have one strand instead of a double helix strand. That is called RNA, and that's what composes most viruses, for example. Now let's look at the timeline for life on Earth. The Earth began about 4.5 billion years ago. It had this collision with Theia, formed the moon and some other things, settled down, asteroids and perhaps comets landed to bring more water to the Earth. The net result is we had oceans fairly soon after things settled down and cooled off a little bit. And within 300 million years of oceans, we began to have very primitive life forms. However, it took a couple billion years before we ended up with cells, with nucleus type creatures. And then all the way up to 4 billion years after the Earth formed before we got hard-shelled animals. And of course, we know it took 4.5 billion years to evolve people who can make PowerPoint presentations. So what does this mean about exoplanets and life in the universe? So let's take a look at something called an HR diagram. Those of you who have seen our talks before have seen a lot of these. For those of you who haven't, ignore the upper and right corner and the lower left corner. This is the end stage of stars. But for most of a star's lifetime, it is spent here on something called the main sequence. That is defined by when a star first forms, it starts burning hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. The gravitational collapse causes the star to collapse. The central regions, the core of the star, become hotter and more dense until finally it reaches a point where hydrogen can fuse or burn into helium. And that generates energy, prevents the star from collapsing further, and begins the star's normal lifetime. Now, there's quite a bit of hydrogen there in that star to burn. And if you look at the main sequence, what you see, this is the graph on the x-axis down at the bottom, showing the temperature of the stars, cooler over to the right, very hot to the left. There are also spectral classifications. I'll point out G, K, and M, for M being the red dim stars. And by dim, what I mean is the luminosity here on the left-hand side of the graph, the inherent luminosity of the star, how bright it is. We have very bright stars that are also very massive and very hot, as you can see here on the left side of the graph. But if you look at their lifetimes here in green, they also have very short lifetimes, millions, tens, hundreds of millions of years. Here's our sun down here with a lifetime of 10 billion years. And you need to be somewhere near the sun in order to have a lifetime of at least 4.5 to 5 billion years. If it really takes that long to develop intelligent life, then the stars that we're looking for to have planets with intelligent life around them would be those that are roughly as old as the sun or older. And those are the stars in the lower right corner here. These are G, K, and M type stars. And in fact, if you look at the number of stars in the Milky Way in each of those classifications that were at the bottom of that graph, what you find is that the most common stars in our galaxy are by far M-type stars, then K and then G, like our sun. So these dim, small, cooler, red dwarf stars are the most common stars in the Milky Way. And we'll get back to those toward the end. Now, people have worked very hard to determine what the environmental conditions were on the early Earth. They've combined information from geology and atmospheric science and lots of other fields and come up with a model of what life looked like, or not life, sorry, the environment looked like on the early Earth. Very little oxygen, quite a bit of carbon dioxide. And this most recent paper published in February of 2020 has a summary of those most recent results. Now, everyone knows probably about Abiogenesis Experiments, Miller-Urey experiment in '53, and those that followed after it. I'm not going to go through all these details. The idea is that they combined the elements that they thought were in the early atmosphere of the Earth, subjected them to energy. In the early experiments, it was lightning that has evolved. But the summary is, in the most recent work, with the currently accepted early atmosphere of the Earth, including hydrogen sulfide from volcanoes and thermal vents. The natural amino acids, along with hydroxides, purines, pyrimidines, peptides, and sugars, were all produced. Then in 2017, a publication came out saying, well, okay, you've got all this stuff laying around, but can you form it into DNA, RNA kinds of things? So they discovered this DAP enzyme, and I'm not going to try to pronounce diamidophosphate, I'm just going to call it DAP. So it's an enzyme that drives a particular type of chemical reaction. They simulated the early Earth conditions in a lab using different combinations of concentrations for trace elements. And they synthesized nucleoside blocks of RNA, then short RNA-like strands, fatty acids, lipids, and peptide chains, all of these organic chemicals. But they do not yet know where the DAP may have come from. Perhaps lava flows leached out of certain minerals, meteorite delivery, and so on. The bottom line is that chemistry was identified that can lead to life, but they can't prove that this is the way that life evolved. But a year later, Roland Reek and some others published a paper in Nature Communications showing that amyloid protein structures can direct selection of amino acids, the building blocks of DNA and RNA, to build even more amyloids. Now, amyloids are proteins with a kink in the middle that clump into long fibers. You may have heard them associated with Alzheimer's disease, for example. Short chains of amino acids called peptides can spontaneously form amyloid structures in the presence of carbon and sulfur. This system of self-replicating protein fragments shows how amino acids could form and help generate new peptides, paving the way for nucleotide chemistry and hence RNA. Now, here's another headline for you. Scientists claim to have recreated Earth's first life. Well, that sounds impressive. Of course, this was just published or made known in the last month, a few weeks ago. But it will be an entire book about this published in July, so this month. And the authors are down at the bottom. Now, what they did was recreate harsh chemical high pressure conditions deep within the Earth's crust as they believed it was 30.8 billion years ago. They then created and destroyed thousands of bubble-like biological structures similar to a cell's membrane. And this system just spontaneously created these things in just a few weeks. Now, some generations were able to better survive because they absorbed certain biomolecules into their membranes that gave an advantage, natural selection, to incorporate biological structures. And some of these may have become stable enough to come to the surface during geyser eruptions or whatever. So I'm not sure I would say they recreated Earth's first life, but they certainly have moved a long way from just creating amino acids in a test tube. Now, before we go into space, let's talk a bit about examples of extreme life on Earth. Bacterial spores we know of that are over 40 million years old, hardened to radiation exposure. There is bacteria found living in the cold and dark in a lake buried a half a mile deep under the ice in Antarctica, where obviously no sunlight exists. And there are certain animals found in hydrothermal vents, shown down to the lower right, in temperatures up to 176 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a wood frog down at the bottom here, I'll mention that first, in Alaska, that can tolerate multiple freeze-thaw cycles. It freezes solid during the winter, thaws out in the spring, goes about its business in the summer, and then refreezes in a dormant state during the winter. Tardigrades, or water bears, can tolerate tremendous temperature variations, huge pressures higher than anything on the Earth, ionizing radiation doses much higher than those lethal for a human. They can survive the vacuum of outer space, and they can be sort of freeze-dried for 30 years, be rehydrated, and forage and reproduce. They will survive on Earth until the sun becomes a red giant in about 5 billion years or so. Asteroids won't kill them, supernovas, full nuclear war, none of that stuff will harm tardigrades. But what about in our own solar system? If we were to look in our own solar system close to us, where might we most likely find life? Is Mars devoid of intelligent life? Well, so far, all the rover tests for life appear to be negative. However, there are flow patterns on the surface of Mars, and here's a false color image that makes it a little easier to see the flow patterns. We have water streaks, flow formations, minerals, polar ice cap observations, all indicate historical flowing water on Mars. Multispectral imaging identifies areas of clay on Mars. That's the green patch in this photo. And the simplest way to form clay is with chemical reactions underwater. We also observe hematite at certain landing sites on Mars, which is the same as that deposited by water-dissolved iron in Utah. Snow and ice-covered dunes on Mars in the Northern Hemisphere suggest water, as does the fact that the Curiosity rover has found at least 8 locations where there are 100-meter thick ice shelves that might easily be accessible by future astronauts. Now, summing everything up that we know about Mars, it would appear that it actually had a fairly large ocean about 3.8 billion years ago. There is a ExoMars rover, largely being built by ESA in Russia, that is expected to launch in 2022. That's a couple of years from now. Its primary goal is to determine if there has been life on Mars. It has a drill that can get samples down to 6 feet underground, where one would expect life to be more likely to have existed instead of the harsh surface, and an elaborate life chemistry lab with an ultra clean zone in the rover. Now, this is an interesting book that has just been published by Sarah Stewart Johnson, who's a planetary scientist at Georgetown University and was on the science teams for the NASA Opportunity and Spirit rovers. And she's written a book on the history and ongoing efforts to look for life on Mars. Where else? Well, if we go a little farther, Europa is one of the moons of Jupiter. Spectroscopic, again, the spectra are really helpful. Evidence suggests that this dark reddish streaks and features on Europa's surface may be rich in salts, such as magnesium, sulfate, and sodium chloride, i.e. salt water like on the Earth, deposited by evaporating water that emerged from within the moon. Here are photos of plumes erupting from Europa. Our best estimates from scientists at the moment is that there is a solid ice covering this liquid ocean, saltwater ocean, very much like the ocean we have on Earth. Now, why is this liquid? It's because two things. One is Europa is close enough to this huge planet, Jupiter, and Jupiter is just really, really large, gas giant, has tremendous gravity. And the gravity affects this moon and tugs and pulls and squishes and expands it, somewhat like our moon creates tides of water in the oceans on the Earth. But this is a much more extreme case, and it molds the inner core of the planet to the extent that it causes heating. In addition to some radioactive elements that would have been deposited there in the formation of the solar system that are also producing some heat, you can get enough heat then, modeling suggests, to create this very large ocean of water. And in fact, how large of an ocean is it? Remember those balls, take all the surface water on the Earth and ball it up into a sphere, and you have a sphere 430 miles in diameter. If you do that on Europa, you would expect the sphere to be about 529 miles in diameter, and that doesn't even include the ice on the surface. Enceladus is another moon that we believe orbiting a gas giant, in this case Saturn. We've seen these fountains on Enceladus, and again, we have the same kind of a model with hydrothermal vents at the base of this ocean, which could be very much like the hydrothermal vents at the base of our oceans on Earth, which in turn many biologists believe might have been a good starting point for life on Earth. The Cassini spacecraft has actually detected or analyzed these emissions, detected hydrogen gas, as well as nitrogen, methane, propane, formaldehyde, salts, and silicon, all sorts of things. But this organisms near a seafloor geothermal vent might, on Earth, use hydrogen and carbon dioxide as fuel for an energy production system called methanogenesis. And all of those elements seem to be present also on Enceladus. Let's look at exoplanets beyond our solar system. Now we have a number of planet candidates. The Kepler spacecraft has identified over 4,000 of them. So most stars seem to have planetary systems around them if we can look close enough. Whoops, too far. I mentioned the habitable zone. All that means is that if you are too close to the star, any water on your surface would evaporate. If you're too far from the star, then water freezes. So there's this zone called the habitable or Goldilocks zone, where one could have liquid water on the surface of a planet. Now, there was another new new study that was just published, again, a couple of weeks ago, that came up with this number of 6 billion Earth-like planets. Basically, they looked at planets that are rocky, roughly Earth-size, orbiting a sun-like star, a G-star like our sun, in the habitable zone, where there could be liquid water. And what they did was they modeled all of the planets and then matched the models to the actual observations. Now, the observations are only a fraction of the planets because Kepler only looked into a narrow area of the sky. But what they tried to do is get the distribution of planets found by Kepler. And then they looked at their model and said, in order to get that distribution of planets that Kepler saw, what would the distribution be throughout the whole galaxy? And their result is that they get 6 billion Earth-like planets in our galaxy around Earth-like stars. Now, that doesn't mean they have life, but they're in the habitable zone. Some others that we know are in the habitable zone, specifically are Kepler 186f, for example, is a red dwarf star, and it has a planet that is in the habitable zone, about the same relative distance from the star as the Earth is from our sun. Of course, this is a cool red star instead of a yellow star. But these red stars really seem to have planets in their habitable zones. Proxima Centauri, the closest star to our own solar system, 4 light years from Earth, has a planet orbiting within the habitable zone, which is roughly Earth size, about 1.3 times the mass of the Earth. Trappist 1, another red dwarf star, has at least 3 planets in its habitable zone that could have liquid water on the surface. Now, is that what the Trappist 1F surface looks like? We don't really know, but we hope with the James Webb Telescope to be able to look at the atmospheres of these planets and get a better handle on what really their surface might look like. We don't know, of course, whether there's any life on the planet or not, but with the James Webb Telescope, we'd like to look at those atmospheres and see if there are indications of life and the chemical traces in the atmospheres of these planets. So if intelligent aliens exist, what would they actually look like? Now, here's the part where we go back to those TV movie aliens, and we say, they just made them look that way because it's easy to put makeup on people and have humanoid kind of things. But E.O. Wilson, who's a Pulitzer-Prize winning biologist, has published on what he would expect intelligent aliens with a civilization to look like based on evolutionary theory and the kind of biology that we see on the Earth. Now, bear with me, this is a little long, but you'll recognize a lot of this stuff. He expects them to be land animals. They need fire to develop the energy for transportable food storage, food sources. They need bilateral symmetry, i.e. split them down the middle, the right half looks a lot like the left half. 99% of Earth animals have this. It's efficient and facilitates movement. He would expect to see a head with bony protection for the brain, high on the body, to be able to spot predators or prey, with nearby sensors, eyes, ears, nose, so on, to minimize time delay for signals to the brain. Eyes to the front of the head to allow for binocular vision, which is the predator arrangement. You can get an estimate of how far away something is with this. 2 to 8 legs, more legs turns out to be inefficient for rapid travel. Arms or tentacles to manipulate its environment. At least 3 fingers for fine control in making and using tools. Omnivores, to get enough energy. Carnivores or vegetarian animals might have a difficulty getting the right amount of energy under certain circumstances. So these creatures would not have large claws, as is found on carnivores. Sized appropriately for the oxygen content and the gravity of the planet, as we mentioned about one of the movies earlier. Also, well, first, let's look at some examples of creatures. Notice that Yoda has 3 fingers, along with arms, bilateral symmetry, eyes, ears, so on. Now, what about group cooperation? Social cooperation and communication, Wilson believes, would be required to establish a civilization. Communication may not be verbal. Insects use scent, chimps use signs, but for groups to survive, they would have to have some type of communication. Also, selfishness wins within a group, but altruism wins in group versus group conflict. Just think about soldiers for specific countries. They're willing to give their lives for what they believe in and for their communities. Thus, a balance of selfishness and altruism would be required. And finally, intelligence probably requires a life form to be a predator. In Wilson's view, consider a lion, tiger, fox, or wolf versus a rabbit or deer. Predators need binocular vision, cunning, stealth, planning, an ambush attack, whereas rabbits just detect a threat and run. Examples of predators on the Earth. Notice the position of the eyes, the ears, the nose, the head, containing these sensor organs, 4 feet or flippers, as the case may be, and so on. So this is the last point I will bring up. There is a paper, again, published this year, in this case in May of this year, on the statistical analysis of the probability of life. David Kipling from Columbia University published this paper that uses very complex Bayesian statistical analysis to look at this question of life arising of any sort, and then intelligent life arising. Now, I'm not going to go through all the mathematics. You can read the paper. If you're really into that sort of thing, it's noted down at the bottom here. But he makes certain assumptions or input to his model. Life arose early in Earth's history, within 300 million years of the ocean. So we would expect that to happen elsewhere as well. Intelligence arose late in the Earth's history, like 4.5 billion years. However, it only arose 1 or so billion years before the end of Earth's habitability, before the sun goes into a phase where it becomes larger and hotter and it's too warm on Earth to support life. So he then modeled all of these things, given all the information he had about planets and the distribution of planets in the galaxy, ran all of these calculations, given this input, and found that early life formed in about 75% of the runs. If he starts with something that looks like the Earth and then just runs it forward statistically, about 75% of the time, 3/4 of the time, early life is formed. He found intelligence evolved in about 60% of the runs. So the overall probability then would be probability of life times the probability of intelligence, or about 45%. Therefore, a planet with identical conditions as the Earth, not taking into account the formation of the moon, only has about a 45% chance of developing intelligent life. But remember that a previous study I talked about indicated there could be as many as 6 billion Earth-like planets in our galaxy alone, and that's just around Earth-like stars, not counting the planets around red dwarfs. This suggests that perhaps half of those, 3 billion, might have intelligent civilizations. So I'll leave you with this. Is there life out there? Will we find it? Will it find us? Will it be intelligent? Will it be technologically advanced? Will we find traces of former life on Mars or Enceladus, for example? Will we only find intriguing implications of the possibilities of life, perhaps on Mars, or indicators in the atmospheres of exoplanets? And then finally, if there is some contact between us and another intelligent species, will they be aggressive or benign? The history of life on Earth is filled with wars, and expansionists always seem to be eliminating or subjugating less technologically advanced civilizations and native populations and appropriating their resources. What would these guys do to us? It's not clear. However, there are perhaps billions of Earth-like planets in the habitable zones of their stars in our galaxy alone. So what does that mean for life in the universe? We're really not quite sure at this point. So with that, let me close and see if Galen has some questions.
Thanks, Rick. That was a great talk. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. We have 29 participants on this PEEC viewing, and I have one question so far. I'll wait and see if there are others coming up. The question refers to tardigrades. You've remarked that they are so robust and hardy that they can survive the vacuum of space, and so that brings up the possibility that perhaps tardigrades are extraterrestrials and have arrived at this Earth at some point in our distant past. What do you have to say about that?
Well, of course, you can't discount that. Now, what you could do is look at the biological structures that compose tardigrades, or the tardigrades are composed of. What we find is that they have the same genetic structures as the rest of life on the Earth, and ourselves included. And that if you look at sequencing the DNA of tardigrades, what you find is that the same genes, gene structures as are found in other life on Earth. Now, on Earth, what people have genetically tried to do is look at the number of changes in gene structure over the years, over millennia, and they find that there is a certain proportion of genes that spontaneously change through radiation or viruses, or whatever it may be, over the years. And they can actually use that as a bit of a clock to go back in time and find out which are older structures, what the oldest structures look like, which structures seem to be common to all plants, all animals, all plants and animals, and so on. And they come down to this conclusion based on the genetic research that we all evolved from a single multicelled creature. And in fact, tardigrades are completely consistent with evolving from that same single multicelled creature. Now, that doesn't mean that perhaps life was jump-started by tardigrades landing on the Earth on a meteor and then populating the Earth with things that eventually grew into the rest of us. And there are people, the theory is called panspermia, that believe that life did arrive on the Earth in meteorites. But of course, that's kind of begs the question because, well, where did the life on the meteorites come from? So you still go back to the same kind of questions that we have now. So it's an interesting idea, but again, the genetics make tardigrades completely consistent with other creatures on the Earth.
Okay, right. Oh, this is interesting. What are your thoughts on the Egyptian helicopter and spacecraft hieroglyphs of SETI?
Okay, those I don't know a whole lot about, so I might pass that along. I don't know, just somebody else who knows more about that than I do. Steve Becker, I don't know if you have a microphone, but if you're around, you can probably say more about that than I could. Galen, I don't know if you are aware of those or not.
No, I have no idea. Yeah, this is from Tony M. Let's see, maybe I can unmute Tony M and ask him a little bit more about that. Tony, are you there? Tony M? Unmute.
I sure am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I more of a conspiracy theorist, but I just saw a documentary. I think the gentleman's name was Steve Greer, that talked about a hieroglyph in a temple called Seti in Egypt that had depictions of a helicopter and a spacecraft, and I thought that was kind of interesting. If you Wikipedia it, you'll actually come up with a picture of it. It's pretty interesting, but
Okay. Well, I should let that just go by, but I do have one observation that may or may not be relevant. There are some fairly famous petroglyphs in southwestern US, I believe, that shows a man riding a dinosaur. And there were some people who got really excited about that in the creationism world. And some people did some studies on those petroglyphs, and they found that there was evidence that there was erosion on those rock faces that made it appear that there were these things were related, when in fact they were originally two separate petroglyphs. And the erosion and other things that had happened over thousands of years had caused them to be a little bit reminiscent of somebody, a stick figure riding a dinosaur, although it wasn't, high definition kind of a thing. You'd have to use your imagination a little bit. And it turned out that it was pretty easy to explain. Now, I don't know about these petroglyphs in Egypt. I've never seen them. I don't know if a similar explanation might work for those or not. But all I would say is it's an interesting point. I tend to be skeptical when I look at those things, but we need to know a lot more about them.
Well, I guess, Rick, you've got a challenge now to look those things up and incorporate them into your next talk on this subject.
Or I just ask my friends here behind me and see if they are.
Yeah, that's the thing to do. Yes, yeah. On your predator slide, maybe you should bring that up. I think somebody who might be in the same room that you are in asks about the flat worm there and asks if planaria are predators.
Planaria are indeed predators in a sense. Let me see if I can figure out where that slide is. Yeah, so you notice that planaria have, they have two eyes, they have sort of a head. They certainly have bilateral symmetry. That was the first thing that we learned in biology in high school, was that these things have bilateral symmetry. And you can't really see it, but they do have, I don't know if you call it a mouth or mandible or something like that, but features on the bottom that allow them to absorb things like bacteria and other critters. So they could be considered predators. They would be the most primitive predators on this slide, but that would make them sort of like predators.
Right, cool. Okay, it's another one. Some slides of other solar system moons have oceans. Most, I guess, were water, but aren't there other, such as methane, oceans such as methane? What is the feeling regarding non-carbon life forms that would exist in a methane ocean?
That's really a good question. And I actually had a slide specifically on that, which I omitted simply because of time. Let me see if I can go back. It's still in the presentation here. See if I can go back and find that. Unfortunately, there's, as you saw, lots of pictures, so it takes me a while. There we go. Getting into the. So yes, Titan, which is a moon of Saturn, has methane oceans. It's possible it actually may have water underneath the surface as well. And so it is one of the candidates for life. Although NASA's first project, it actually has funding to build a spacecraft to orbit Enceladus, which was the other moon I was talking about, Europa, sorry, a moon of Jupiter, the Clipper mission. to try to understand more about the ocean around that might be under the ice in Europa. But to get back to this, yes, Titan has methane oceans. It's the only object in our solar system that has liquid on the surface other than the Earth. In the case of Titan, it is methane. It has clouds, sulfuric acid clouds and methane clouds, and these oceans and a topography that looks quite a bit actually like the Earth. So that is certainly something that is of interest. Because of that and other reasons, science has tried very hard to see what other life might be able to exist there. Carbon-based life forms would have a problem. Methane is a good solvent, as water is, but it tends to destroy carbon molecules. So it's a problem for carbon-based life forms. So people started looking at silicon. Now, remember I said carbon seemed to be the only one that made sense because of the complex chemistry of life. Well, it turns out that silicon's chemistry does have some similarity to carbon, although it is 7 times less abundant. There's no other element that shares the complex chemistry possibilities of carbon and silicon, and the reason is because carbon and silicon both have 4 valence outer electrons and can bond to oxygen as well as nitrogen and hydrogen. Each forms long chains, and silicon can be dissolved by sulfuric acid. There is indeed sulfuric acid on Titan. And also in the clouds of Venus, as a matter of fact, if you like cloud-based life forms, perhaps silicon bacteria or something like that. But carbon oxidizes to carbon dioxide, which is a gas. Silicon oxidizes to silicon dioxide, which you probably recognize as a solid, silica or sand, or glass if it's heated. Silicon likes oxygen too well and forms SiO4, which is in feldspars, mica, zeolites, talcs, things. These solid systems pose a waste disposal problem for a living system. Carbon-based life forms burn carbohydrates to water and carbon dioxide, which is released to air. Burning regulated by enzymes. Silicon would release silicon dioxide, sand, solid things, and that's a lot harder to get rid of. Silicon has no analog to regulate the energy that enzymes do for carbon-based life forms. Despite years of work and all the reagents available to the modern alchemist, many silicon analogs of carbon compounds just cannot be formed. The thermodynamic data confirm these analogs are often too unstable or too reactive. So our view right now, and you can look up this paper that was published in 2020, that was just a few months ago, that looked at the latest attempt to try to use silicon as a possible life form. Silicon-based chemistry is just too limited to be a basis for life. And carbon would be threatened by the environment on Titan. Now, it's possible that underground there is water and certainly carbon. And so is it possible that underground in Titan somewhere there could be some type of carbon-based life form? That's clearly a possibility, and Titan is one of the planets that people look at in the solar system that could potentially be related to life. But first, they want to see if Mars had any life in the past, to see if Europa and Enceladus, which seem to be very similar, might have life near the fumaroles at the bottom of these oceans, and then they might get to Titan. Okay. Okay.
Yes, thanks for everyone attending, and thanks especially to Rick for presenting this talk. You've done quite a lot of research on brand new articles and so forth that that have informed this talk, and I think certainly I enjoyed it, and I hope everyone else did too. Of course, there will be an evaluation going out to everybody from PEEC. Please respond to that evaluation form and tell us how you like this talk, and help us help give us guidance on what kinds of talks we should do in the future. It's 8:15, so I think we've spent enough of your time. Thank you all for joining us. Consider if you could, giving a donation to the Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEEC, as many organizations are during these troubled times. You know, we're closed to the public, but we still have to keep preparing programs and paying staff members and so forth, so we could you know, use whatever help we can get. So there is a donate button on the website. Please consider using it. Thanks everyone, and we hope to see you next week. What is the talk next week, Rick?
As a matter of fact, I happen to know what the talk is next week, and it is going to be sort of forward-looking at the future of space exploration. I believe, isn't it?
And that's you giving the talk next week, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm going to be giving that talk, and it is part of the Science Week. So
that's right. Yes.
Science Fest. It's the theme for Science Fest this time is forward-looking technology, and so I'm going to be talking about some of the recent advances in spacecraft development. The SpaceX Dragon capsule that just flew recently to the ISS, International Space Station, and beyond that, looking at moon bases, Mars bases, and so on. So the future of human space exploration. That'll be 7 o'clock next Friday, and I'll be doing that one as well. Thanks.
Excellent. All right, thanks for joining us, and please join us again next week for Rick's talk on future of space exploration. Bye, everyone.